Hey, good morning. It is September 1st. It is the day before Labor Day, and everybody gets serious about work again. So I figured I'd try to help you kick off the last trimester of the year with some thoughts about what I hear most common when it comes to social media and the use of social media in business. And a lot of this ties back to things that I've already done myself, whether it be in social media or quite a few other areas as well, where just through sheer naivete, things worked out pretty well. Without further ado, then let's get into this presentation. So this presentation originally was kind of cool. I gave it as a Pacheco Chat, which is, if you're not familiar with a Pacheco Chat, it is a speech format where you have just let me move this out of the way. There we go. Where you have a very limited amount of time to speak, and you have 20 slides, and they're 20 seconds each, and they advance without you. And I was asked the day before this event to put something together, and this is what I created. But what was cool about it is having a really expedited timeline. It forced me to be very concise, which obviously by the format it already is, and then also it forced me to codify a bunch of ideas that I hadn't done before. Hey Nancy, thanks for tuning in. So it looks like I am monitoring comments. I'm just going to say, hey Nancy, back. There we go. So thanks for tuning in live with me, Nancy. I really appreciate it. And as I go through this very brief presentation, it's going to form up, I feel like, a really good hypothesis for both you and for me, frankly, when it comes to the reinforcement of what we can do, especially when it comes to the use of social media in business. Now, let me just talk about this really quickly. I had very distinct aspirations when I was young of doing these 5 things that I'm going to talk about with you. And based on what I discovered after doing the work is that it kind of boiled down to a similar theme that I discovered over time. And the first thing I wanted to do when I was young, when I was in high school, this was back before weightlifting was really popular, or certainly gotten as popular as it has now, where I thought it'd just be kind of cool to get buff, right, as they say. So I started working at GNC when I was in college, learning about weight gainer and creatine and all this other stuff back then. And what I read was this thing called Men's Health. Now, I didn't have a Men's Health subscription, but because I worked at GNC, part of my job was actually reading Men's Health and trying to keep track of what it is that happened there. Now, what I thought was kind of funny about this is if you look at all of these issues in Men's Health, they're very, very similar as to the title. And I think the big social media lesson here specifically is just because you did something once, don't assume that anybody had read it. So you see that all of these talk about six-pack abs and a bunch of other stuff that's very, very common. And in fact, they use the same numbers in several of them as well. So don't assume that people see your stuff, and just because it's become old to you, it maybe isn't even on the radar of somebody else. Now, besides the Men's Health thing, which was all over the place and it was very trendy, what I tried to think about was, okay, if I'm going to try to get big and buff and whatever, I need to focus on one resource and use that as my version of the truth, so to speak. Now, back then, back in, let's say, the early, maybe late 90s, early 2000s, there really wasn't much information that was available, and certainly not available for free like it is now. And I think that's really, really important to think about right now, is that we are so overwhelmed with all of this information constantly that information gets in the way of doing things. And I very distinctly recollect going to the library when I was a kid, and I wanted to read Value Line, which for those of you in financial services, Value Line is the thing that people used to research stocks with. And I'd go to the library and it'd be checked out by somebody. So somebody would be there doing their research, their stock research, and I couldn't use it. So we had finite resources, right? But in retrospect, this was a blessing. And here's what I mean. So when I went to Arnold's book, which is, if you've ever bodybuilded or didn't, I don't know, I just use bodybuilded as a verb. I don't think that's a verb. So excuse me. That's the nice thing about live broadcast, right? So I discovered this book, the New Encyclopedia of Modern Bodybuilding, and I used this one resource. So what I did first is I lifted some, I tried to figure it out, got in the gym, figured out if I liked it or not, and established that I really liked it, especially after the fact. And then I went to this book and I said, okay, now that I'm an amateur in this space, how do I get better? And that's where I relied on Arnold's book and Arnold's book only. So once I started reading this book, that's it. So I certainly didn't get as big as Arnold, but it got pretty big. Back in the day, it was pretty cool to have this, actually form up some kind of, body that, was appealing, I guess, in some capacity. So that actually worked out fairly well. Now let's segue to topic number 2. That was topic number 1, is learning how to lift and get big. Topic number 2 was the band, as you can see here. Now, when we first started as the band, this is the kind of show that we would play. This was, believe it or not, this was for a charity walk, and we were in the middle of the charity walk. There's me in the very back playing drums, and this is a charity walk where people were actually walking around us on a track. That shows you some scope as to how few people were actually in there. And as Nancy had said in the comments here, focus. So thank you for that, Nancy. I appreciate that. And when I looked at this, I go, well, this isn't the way that we get to be a big band. We have to do something better than this. So again, if you're reading on my theme here, I found one book. And this book was called The Real Deal by a lady named Dale Swartz. And what she had said is that if you can just focus on finding what a record label wants and getting in front of the right people, it's not really about sheer talent at all. It's about just finding what they want and then getting it to them. So first, tried the band thing, figured out that we really, really liked doing it. And then I read a resource and then only relied on that resource, period. I didn't deviate. I didn't go, oh, well, here's another book over here. I should go read that before we do anything. So we tried stuff, figured out that we liked it, found a resource, found our version of the truth, and just continued down that path. And eventually, we got to play shows like this. This is in Lafayette, Indiana. There's probably, I don't know how many, over 1,000 people were there. But we actually had to stitch together 2 photos because we took this photo from stage, and the crowd was so big, we actually had to put these together. So that was a really, really cool endeavor. Had a blast with the band, and it was something that I think played out wonderfully well from an entrepreneurial standpoint, because there's nothing like creating your own music, performing it, and then having people say that they like it. It's really, really amazing. Very much parallels what speaking is for me today, which is pretty awesome. And thank you, Nancy, for saying it's fun to learn about my past. It's fun to share about my past. Thank you. So the third thing, I guess, was real estate investing. And this is not a great house, but this is one of the houses that I bought very early on out of college. I realized that real estate investing, if you do it systematically, would be a good way to acquire a bunch of wealth over time. So I really appreciate that it had that opportunity for me. But then after doing a little bit of research up right off the bat on real estate investing and figured out financing and stuff like that, I just went headlong into it. But then I figured out I really needed a better strategy as opposed to just acquiring properties ad hoc and not doing much beyond that. So figured out that I liked real estate investing and then went and found a book. And this book was actually really, really hard to find. It had to go to eBay, a very early version of eBay, and find this book, and it was way out of print. And it was very, very difficult to locate it for sale, and then I had to pay a lot of money for it. So I researched this book and discovered that what this gentleman had laid out, William Nickerson, was how you take properties and then after you buy kind of the junkier properties, like the one I showed you, how you build up to something better over time through systematically building. Oh, and Nancy said not far from her in Lafayette. Very cool. Yeah, I think you're in Indy, if my memory serves, Nancy. So thanks for sharing that. So that was my version of the truth, so to speak, is looking at this book and going, okay, try the real estate thing, focused on doing exactly what William Nickerson had laid out in his book. Again, one version of the truth, didn't deviate, and eventually got properties like this. So it was a really cool thing. Next thing, fourth thing, was an IT company. Now, I was very fortunate when I was still in college to start working at IBM Global Services, just before the Y2K thing. So at the time, technology was just really in its infancy as far as the personal computer ending up on both work desks and then at homes as well. And what I figured out is after the Y2K thing and after doing some contract consulting is that post Y2K, a lot of the budget dried up that IT had focused on. And in fact, before Y2K, the term CIO or CTO wasn't even a thing back then. You had maybe a network administrator, a database administrator, but we didn't have people that were heavy into IT. So in 2002, I left the contract consulting world and started a small IT consulting company. Tried it at first, figured out that I liked it, figured out that I liked working for myself, and then started looking for a resource. And the resource that I found was a guy named Joshua Feinberg, and he focused specifically on small business computer consulting. Now, just to show you how much of a blast from the past this is circa 2005 or so, he used to have call-in webinars. It's before he called them webinars. I think we call them like telewebinars or something like that. I can't remember exactly what it was. But we'd get on and he'd share his slideshow, much like I'm doing right now, but we'd have to dial in and listen, and then he'd pitch his wares at the end. Wonderful, wonderful resource for me because it helped me systematize, again, my business and treat it more like a business as opposed to just a break-fix kind of thing. Ended up selling that business to an accounting firm in 2006, and a lot of that credit for the success of that company was based on Joshua Feinberg. So again, to reiterate, try a bunch of stuff, figure out if you like it, find one version of the truth, and then do exactly what that expert had proposed that you do. Last job I did, or the fifth thing I want to share with you, is I was a 401k wholesaler. So for those of you in financial services, you know that I went through my Series 7, 63, 65, got all those licenses, and then just blindly started going out and seeing people and hoping that we would do 401k work together. And this picture here is me with my company issued Chevy Impala holding my trusty iPass, which is the toll thing that we use in Chicago, and I'd put on about 40,000 miles a year. Now, I was really, really fortunate at the time to have a boss named Todd Thompson, who was a wonderful boss, and as I was going through this process of doing this job, he wrote a book, and it was called To Sell or Not to Sell Employer Retirement Plans. So I figured out I really liked the job. I went headlong into Todd's book, learned everything I possibly could about it, took his ideas, and ran with it to be better at what it is that I was doing in 401ks. And this worked out really well as well. So if I followed Todd's advice, eventually get to go up on stage at sales conferences and hold up big oversized checks, which is always a really cool thing. So for me, these were the 5 resources that I relied on in 5 very disparate areas. Now you notice that there's one resource for each respective area. And my big point, especially with social media these days, is you need to get out of your own way and figure out if something is going to work for you or not. By that, I mean typically now, because the internet's free and everything can be available ubiquitously, right, on any device that we want, it's really, really easy to go down the rabbit hole of our business, my personal brand, our company, we should be on Twitter. Okay, cool. Well, let's research Twitter. Let's figure out exactly what to do with Twitter. Do we use these tools or publish this way, or images or videos or copy or whatever? And then you go to Twitter and you go, man, I don't even like this. Like, I don't get it. I don't understand the back and forth. I don't understand the hashtags. I don't understand how to follow people, why they're following me, why they're unfollowing me, all of this stuff. So you go and you learn a bunch of stuff, and then you go to the platform and go, well, shoot, this really wasn't for me. And I see this now as the major impediment for everybody. Because me included, we go, well, before I go LinkedIn Live, I better do a bunch of research and figure out how best to do it. No, I had to get out of my own way. This is about my 10th LinkedIn Live I've done so far. I asked my friend Nancy, who's on live with us now, as well as my other friend, hey, how did you do this? And they sent me their advice as to the platforms. I just figured out the platforms a little bit because it's not as simple as it should be, and just went into it and said, okay, now that I'm coming up for air a little bit, 10 episodes in, let's figure out if it's playing out or not. So I like it a lot. And now it's up to me to figure out what are the best practices for myself and then pass those on to you. Because there is no LinkedIn Live handbook. No one's been doing it long enough to tell you if it's worth it or not. So what I hope to do eventually, and this is something that we had done with our book, is figure out a bunch of stuff, figure out what works, write it, broadcast it live, broadcast it via video, audio, etc., and then put it into some kind of book where it's a well thought out, well articulated way to say, here's exactly what to do on live platforms for business. Because people are doing this on YouTube. Obviously, every kid you ever talk to these days want to be a YouTuber, right? To become a noun, a YouTuber. But for business people, like, we get in our own way a lot. We go, well, that's new technology. I'm not going to get it. But you guys, this is where so many people are spending a part of their day each day, and if you're not showing up in front of them, they're not thinking about you. And that's the gist of the book that we wrote. Retama stands for Return on Top of Mind Awareness. So either people are thinking about you or they're not thinking about you. So thank you guys very much for tuning in live. What I'd like to do next is go back to something that perhaps might make sense for you, and that's going into the comments a little bit more and probably doing a live webinar to get more engagement from you so we can start building out a best practice set for LinkedIn Live, because I was one of the very early adopters of LinkedIn Live, as was Nancy, and as she said in the comments here, we get to make it our own, right? You're 100% right, Nancy. So I feel like a lot of those who are early on LinkedIn Live, it's incumbent upon us to learn what works. I mean, right now, the engagement aspect is really difficult. It's really putsy because I have to ping back and forth between screens and try to figure out what people are saying. And if you saw my setup here, you'd be flabbergasted because I have 4 screens going. It's like just trying to figure out what people are saying. But as this platform gets better, and as you can use it again for a personal brand or for your company brand to get more people to think about you, to understand you, to show behind the scenes videos, to just go ad hoc and go live. Because ironically, what I found is that when you go live, there's less pressure. You can't edit. You can't go back and say, oh, I better fix that, or I made a silly noise, or maybe something messed up on the screen or whatever. Like, you just have to keep running with it. And I think that's so important for all of us that want to be effective communicators. So again, thank you so much for tuning in. I really appreciate it. And I very much look forward to your comments on this post as well as posts that we do in the future. Hope you have a wonderful Labor Day weekend. Thanks for tuning in on a Sunday, and I'll talk to you again soon. Thanks. See ya. Bye.